Imagine sculpting a landscape in Unreal and the material just paints itself. So that's what I've been working on, a fully procedural landscape shader that updates life as you shape the terrain. So you rise a hill, carve a valley, and it adapts instantly. And the best part, it's super customizable so you can get exactly the look you want. I call it the Topographic Landscape material. It's a set of shaders made just for Unreal landscapes. Kinda like those colorful maps you'd find in a geography atlas, but here we are in real-time 3D. In this video, I'll show you all the features, how you can adjust it with exposed parameters, and how you can set it up with a little blueprint helper tool. So let's dive in. Alright, so for the setup I have a completely blank level with only a directional light and a post-process volume that I set to be unbound. I also disable the auto exposure so it will not mess up with our brightness. So now let's go ahead and create the new landscape. And here you can create a completely new one based on some parameters like scale, section size, and so on. But it actually doesn't really matter how big or how dense your landscape is going to be. Just make sure to choose anything that works for your level or for your animation. You can also import a height map from the file. And by the end of the video, I'm going to show you how I exported the height map from, this open world so I could better showcase my material examples. Alright, so if you have landscape, let's create the material. You can either create a new one from the examples that I have here, or you can create one from scratch. So let's go ahead and do that. And with this version 1.0, you have an access to two master materials, an opaque one and masked one. This one is used for, this fake semi-translucent look. So we're gonna take a look at this in a sec. But first, let's create the new material out of the opaque one. And let's drag and drop to landscape material slot. Once you open up the material instance you just created, you're gonna see several categories of exposed parameters, like sea level, some topographic lines, and so on. But the most important one is setup. So here you have to specify height remap low and height remap high, which kinda tells the shader where the landscape lowest point is and where the highest point is. And of course, I would go nuts if I had to, manually measure the distance, the lowest and the highest distance. So I created a dedicated tool that will calculate that just for you. So let's go ahead and navigate to Blueprint folder, right click, run editor utility widget, and this little helper tool will pop up. So what this tool actually does is it calculates the lowest and the highest point of your selected landscape, so the shader knows how to draw a gradient going from the lowest point to the highest point. I also need this normalized height data for other calculation, but that's a different story. Alright, so let's go ahead and do that. So I have selected my landscape. Now I can click on the update button and it gave me two numbers. Now I can give or paste those two numbers here, like 13.4 and 148.9. So once I provided those two numbers, you can see the gradient is displayed correctly. Of course, if I were to edit the landscape after this, like adding, let's say, a mountain that's above the highest point, I can still do that, of course, but I would need to re-enter the highest value again. That can be pretty boring, so I created a simpler solution or easier solution. So the only thing you need to do is just select a landscape and load that material onto the slot and click update. So now if I refresh the material, you see that those two values has been applied automatically and the color gradient is now displaying properly. So another important parameter is the contour interval. It affects both the gradient and topographic lines look. Basically, it's just a value in Unreal units. So if I, for example, change it from 100 to, let's say, 500, now the lines will be drawn every 500 units. As you can see, now the gradient also becomes more stepped. Let me temporarily turn off the top lines. Now you can clearly see how the gradient is drawn. And if you don't want that stepped look, you can switch it to a smooth transition instead. Anyway, the contour lines should be mainly adjusted depending, I don't know, of the size of your landscape or simply how dense you want those lines to appear. Okay, the color section is exactly what the name says. This is where we define the color of our landscape. You can either use these two colors to create a gradient like we did before, or you can pick a dedicated color curve asset. And I've included a few examples so you can take a look later on. Of course, you can edit them yourself. If you open up and see on the left side, we got the color that represents the lowest point of your landscape. And on the right, you've got the color that represents the highest. And one note, when you swap a color curve for a different one, for some reason the material doesn't update automatically. Just change anything, any parameter, and it will refresh itself. I don't know what happens. So then we've got the fill parameter, which basically controls brightness, and also the Fresnel effect, where you can adjust both intensity and fall off. Just, play around with these settings and see what you like the best. Next, we've got the topographic lines, or as they are sometimes called, elevation lines. And this is probably one of the most important or cool features of the shaders, in my opinion. And here you can control the intensity. It's basically how visible the lines are. You can also make them thicker or thinner, just like that. And one thing to keep in mind that the thickness is tied to your viewport resolution. So let me show you what I mean. So here you've got the screen percentage, and you may have a different value than I have, but personally I like setting it to like 100 or even 150 for much cleaner lines. Okay, then you have the option to use minor lines. This essentially lets you define how many additional lines should appear between the main ones. And of course, this is all linked to the contour interval parameter we talked before. And now, if you're not using a custom color, the lines actually use the landscape color, that gradient that we discussed like a second ago, but I think it often looks great if you just set them to black. So that way the lines are consistent all across the landscape, just like that. And finally, you can fade the lines with camera distance. So this is especially useful when you're working with a, I don't know, very large landscape or with dense line spacing. So you avoid kind of a flicker in the distance. Then we have the thick directional light effect, which is the reason why we need a directional light in our scene. And now if I rotate that light, you see that shading on our landscape changes. And actually, the light intensity of that light doesn't really matter. Same goes with the color, because the shader, the landscape material is unlit and all the shading happens within the shader itself. However, we can still control the effect with these exposed parameters. Like I can make it completely off, I can make it a little darker, I can make it really intense. Then we have light bands, which kind of controls the smoothness of that shading. So if I go all the way down to 0, you see that the gradient is really smooth. Whereas if I go like to 1, it kind of creates, I don't know, maybe some stylized landscape. So you get the idea. And finally, we got the bias parameter, which kind of controls how much of the light leaks on the landscape surface. So if I go all the way up to 1 or close to 1, you see that only some section of the landscape gets highlighted, whereas if I go to 0 or close to 0, most of the landscape is affected with that effect. Then we have this grid effect, which is essentially a procedural grid that gets projected on top of landscape. So similarly to what we had with topographic lines, I can change its size. Like now it uses the 500 by 500 units. So let's make it 1000. Then we can make more divisions like 2, 3. So yeah, you get the idea. So yeah, it looks like a typical grid that is on top of a map. You can also change, I don't know, the color of that pattern, but I think the black one looks the best. And here you get also the rotation, so you can change it, or you can actually use it without the topographic lines. So yeah. And the last thing we can adjust is the sea level. How cool is that? So this basically simulates how the terrain would look like if it was, flooded with water. To raise the water level, we just changed the sea level parameter. But keep in mind that this isn't world space where, 0 means world origin, like you have in the details transform here. Instead, it's a value between the lowest and the highest point of your landscape. So similar like we had in gradient. So if I set it to 1, the whole terrain gets submerged. But usually I keep it really, really slow, like, let's say the percentage of people who actually subscribe to my channel, about 3.8%. That's so low it barely covers the under logo. Anyway, we can also control the fall off, which sets how smoothly the water blends with the rest of the landscape. Like the value of 0 gives you the perfectly sharp edge. Now there's also this neat feature that allows or uses the terrain's topography to darken the watercolor, revealing the ground underneath. Like you can control the contrast and so on. And speaking of color, of course you can change the watercolor, like maybe this. But I think the good old blue just works best here. Now if I enable snapped lines feature, the fall off disappears completely and the water level automatically snaps to the contour lines, which, as we already know, are controlled by the contour interval parameter. So that way, rising or lowering the sea level always aligns with the nearest topographic lines. Alright, so we've checked out the main features of the base shader, so now let me show you how you can convert that to masked or semi-transparent version. And it's actually really simple. You can just swap the parent material to masked. And it's because the shader logic is almost the same, with only small differences to achieve, that fake transparency. So actually most of the parameters are identical to the opaque version. Yeah, so only a few tweaks here and there, you get that nice transparency effect. And I think that this version of the material works really great for things like VFX or, I don't know, motion graphics. And notice that the water level, here you can also get extra control over transparency. So let me maybe show you a few more examples in different color variations, different topographic lines. Alright, and the last thing before we wrap up, let me show you how you export a height map from a landscape. Now, if you already sculpt a landscape, you can save its height data to a file and reuse it later. And the process is really simple. You select the landscape, you go to landscape mode, and in the manage tab, pick the import option. I know it says import, but stick with me. Here, you just change it to export, you set the save path, and I always like to choose to save it as a single file, so you have, one single height map texture. Next, you have to decide if you want to export all layers or just the one you've got selected. And like in my case, I only use the base layer here, so let's hide this flat middle part. And yeah, it reveals the under logo, in case you didn't know. Alright, so hit export and you've got a height map textures ready to be used on a new landscape. Alright guys, I hope you enjoyed this shader. The topographic landscape material will be available on Fab very soon. If you have any questions or ideas for future updates, feel free to reach out. I've also got this public roadmap with upcoming features, so go ahead and check it out if you'd like to follow along. Alright guys, thanks for watching and I'll see you next time.